Welcome to Kontext TV. Our guest today is Chris Hedges, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and former New York Times correspondent.
Welcome to Kontext TV, Mr. Hedges. It is a real pleasure meeting you today here in New York. Your latest book is called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. In the book you're talking about sacrifice zones. What do you mean by those?
Places that were forced to kneel before the dictates of the marketplace, where there was no impediment to corporate profit, and communities, individuals, the environment were all destroyed. And they're important because when you look at these places, the coal fields of southern West Virginia, the produce fields in Florida, former manufacturing centers like Camden, New Jersey, which is now per capita the poorest city in the country and the most dangerous, or Indian reservations where the whole sort of demented project of ceaseless economic exploitation began, you get a window into what they're going to do to the rest of us. Because as these impediments have been lifted on corporate power, they will replicate that commodification of the world. Everything is a commodity. Human beings are commodities. The natural world is a commodity that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And we went to those sacrifice zones basically to show people what's going to happen if we don't overturn the corporate coup d'etat that's taken place in the United States.
You're saying in your book that the American dream is a lie.
Of course it's a lie.
Why is revolt the only hope that is left?
Because the formal mechanisms of power, those liberal institutions that were designed to make incremental and piecemeal reform possible, no longer function. And either we carry out acts of civil disobedience, or we will create a neo-feudalistic corporate state.
You say that liberal institutions are to blame for the downward spiral of the American political system, and argue that the liberal class, the press, universities, liberal religious institutions, labor unions, and the Democratic Party have forsaken their core values and sold out to corporate interests. Would you explain what you mean by this?
Sure. I mean, Obama, speaks in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, just like Clinton, but he serves corporate interests, as Clinton did. We saw under the Clinton administration the passage of NAFTA, the 1994 bill that was the greatest assault on working men and women in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very difficult to unionize. It was Clinton who destroyed traditional welfare, and 70% of those recipients were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the Federal Communications Commission, which permitted a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, to essentially buy up the airwaves. And it was Clinton that ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, precipitating the national and global meltdown. Now, what did he get? I mean, he got corporate money, so that by the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama first ran for president in 2008, they got more. So this quote-unquote neoliberalism is a deep betrayal. It's just another mask for corporate power.
What is, according to the mainstream media, the Occupy movement has disappeared. Nobody's talking about it right now. Do you think that the Occupy movement has failed? Or will there be another uprising?
There'll be something, because it's always the ruling elite that determines the configurations of revolt. They did not respond to the issues that push people into the encampments. Indeed, things are getting worse, so there will be something. What, when, what it will look like, will it call itself Occupy? I don't know, but the only thing I know is something's coming.
And you say, please talk about the prison system in the U.S. About 2.2 million people are in prison right now. Most of them are African Americans or Hispanic people. What are the reasons for this?
Well, because African Americans as a group traditionally have a much higher consciousness in terms of power, because they've been victims of white supremacy and white power. And again, this was under Clinton that expanded the prison system. And it is a way to essentially break, potentially, a politically rebellious class. And that's why most people in prison are poor and of color. 2.2 million of them.
American history is mostly taught as a history of heroic pilgrims and unlimited opportunities.
Well, that's a lie. Ask a Native American or an African American what the history of the United States is. Get a pretty different picture. Well, every country teaches national myth, with the exception of Germany because of the trauma of World War II. But go to Austria, you'd think World War II never happened. or that the Austrians were its victims. And I think that that historical myth that you see in a country like Austria is very prevalent in the United States. We carried out egregious acts of genocide and enslavement, disenfranchisement of huge sections of this country. And we've never confronted the deep violence that runs like an undercurrent through American culture, and how after westward expansion we exported that kind of violence and repression to Cuba, to the Philippines, and of course today it's being carried out in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that makes us a very deeply illusioned country, and that's not a very healthy way to be, because when you when you are that self-deluded, you can't respond to reality.
What is the situation of Native Americans right now?
Well, I mean, by the turn of the 20th century, 95% of indigenous peoples in North and South America were dead, or had been obliterated from the time of the conquest until then. They're kept on reservations. Originally, they were prisoner of war camps. They're broken. They're utterly dependent. It's a culture of dependence. Their traditions, their language, their religion were taken from them. There's a kind of effort to revive it. But Pine Ridge is one of the poorest pockets of the country. We write a chapter about it. The average life expectancy for a male on Pine Ridge is 48. That's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti.
Historic censorship in the U.S. Has an effect on the politics.
Of course, because if you don't know who you are, or you're self-deluded about who you are, then you don't actually understand what you're doing. We are detested throughout the Middle East, with good reason. And yet I think very few Americans have any sense of how hated they are, and how people throughout the Middle East who are asking one basic, simple question, and that is not to be occupied, how they have every right to hate us. And that would be, considered a kind of seditious statement within mainstream America. Yet, having spent 7 years in the Middle East and being an Arabic speaker, it's true.
What is your overall assessment of Obama's policy?
Right. Well, Obama's carried on all of the policies of the Bush administration in terms of imperial war, and let's be clear, those are illegal. Preemptive war under post-Nuremberg laws is illegal. It is defined as a criminal war of aggression. He has expanded the drone attacks. He has kill lists in which he will put down the names of U.S. citizens, including the Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Alwaki and his 16-year-old son 2 weeks later, who was on no terrorism list. And his assault on civil liberties within the United States has been worse than under Bush. The interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act is giving him the right to assassinate American citizens. The FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans. The use of the Espionage Act to silence whistleblowers, and we just saw a former CIA official who exposed war crimes, Kiriako, go to prison for 30 months. And finally, the NDAA. So, despite all his rhetoric, Obama, in terms of constitutional rights, has been even worse than George W. Bush.
In 2012, you sued the Obama administration because of the National Defense Authorization Act, and were later joined by Noam Chomsky and others. What is the act about, and what was today's outcome?
Well, the National Defense Authorization Act overturns 200 years of domestic law and permits the military to carry out policing on American soil, to seize American citizens, hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, strip them of due process, and keep them there indefinitely. It's a pretty amazing and draconian law, and it has bipartisan support, signed into law a little over a year ago by President Obama. And then January of 2012, Carl, Bruce, and I, issued a lawsuit, in large part because as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, I spent considerable time with individuals and groups that are listed on the State Department terrorism list, including al-Qaeda. And there's no exemption for journalists in this kind of provision. It could easily, and then Judge Forrest found this to be true, journalists like myself could easily be seen as substantially supporting, to quote the language of 1021, these groups and detained under these provisions. So that's why we brought the suit.
And what happened today? And what will be
Well, today, Judge Forrest ruled that Section 1021 was unconstitutional. She issued a injunction, which means that the law was invalid. The Obama administration appealed, and then it goes to the appellate court, which is where we were today. The appellate court will decide to uphold Judge Forrest's ruling or reject it. If they uphold it, it's very clear that the Obama administration will push this into the Supreme Court in a matter of weeks. If they reject it, then we will appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court could decide not to take it, in which case the law stands.
You worked for the New York Times as a foreign correspondent for many years. Why did you leave the newspaper in 2003?
Well, that's all public. I denounced the Iraq War. I was the Middle East bureau chief. I had written a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and I would be on national shows, and having spent so long in the Middle East, people would ask me about the calls to invade Iraq, and I denounced it. And this eventually led to the paper giving me a formal written reprimand demanding that I not speak out about the war, and I refused and left the paper.